Fire Emblem, the Sacred Stones took many steps to make the game more accessible to beginners, such as a stupidly easy difficulty option, extensive tutorials, and Ceph. Among these steps is the in-game guide that was introduced to the series and has appeared in many subsequent games since. Sacred Stones was one of the first Fire Emblem games I had played, so this guide was a massive help for me, as it helped me understand some of the more complex mechanics Fire Emblem had to offer. However, many are not aware that the 5th game in the series, Thracia 776, also had a guide planned to be included in-game, that was ultimately scrapped. This guide is actually still accessible in-game if you modify a couple values in the game's ROM with a hex editor. For exact directions on how to do this, as well as further reading, please check out the Cutting Room Floor article I've linked in the description below. I'd also like to use this opportunity to thank Zane for providing the technical details on how this can be done, as well as bookofholsety for translating the text you're about to see. Once we've modified these values, we just have to enter the status menu in-game and voila! Alright, I don't know Japanese, but even if I did, I reckon I'd have difficulties understanding this. As you can see, many kanji characters, letters, and punctuation is glitched on this menu. Many of these symbols don't actually exist in the game's code. They might have been removed due to space limits, or perhaps they had never been included in the first place. We likely will never know which one it is. Alright, now let's take a look at this elusive guide and look at what's inside of it, or at least what's left of the contents. To my surprise, it's much more detailed than I had expected. For starters, this entry here describes the basic gameplay loop. There are detailed entries on the mechanics of capture and rescue, both of which made their first appearance in this game. Well, this certainly would have helped me when I had first played this game years ago. Speaking of which, there also are entries meant to give advice to players and especially to newcomers. These are actually quite useful in my opinion. For instance, this bit outlines the importance of capturing enemies in this game, since the player is low on funds and weapons, especially in the early game. There is also a brief inclusion of the fact that some events may require capturing certain units in order to occur. These events of course are the recruitments of Lifis and Misha, as well as some dialogue being altered depending on whether the boss of the chapter was killed or captured. There is some information on stealing, also mentioning how mounted units can't be captured, which means you have to steal from them in order to get their items. And this entry explains in what situations the rescue mechanic might prove useful. Now this seems to be pretty standard guide stuff, so to speak. However, as this guide was scrapped, much of the placeholder text remained alongside the incomplete text itself, which lets us into some fun insight into the development of this game. For instance, this entry here hints that a convoy tied to a unit like in the later games was planned to be included, but even here it's mentioned that it's unlikely for it to be in the final game. As you may know, the game instead ended up featuring supply houses located on certain chapters that could store items. The controls entry also lists a couple of button combinations for debugging that the developers used, such as checking events and doping, which I assume is increasing a unit's stats. Now these obviously are not in the final game. There also are some mildly amusing things here, such as the terrain entry simply reading, "Yep." It seems they were not sure exactly how detailed this explanation should be. On a similar note, the entry for items indicates that a developer was probably frustrated with the growing popularity of online guides at the time, writing, "I wonder if we even need this given that help is available online." This is actually somewhat true, because there is a chapter-by-chapter guide for Thracia on Nintendo's website, and it still is online to this day. Granted, this guide is pretty bare bones, and it also doesn't go in depth into some of the mechanics of Thracia 776, like this guide would have eventually done. Thracia is no doubt one of the most complex games in the series for beginners, which begs the question, why wasn't this guide ever finished? Well, if I had to guess, it's either time or space limitations, and maybe even both, but I will bet on the latter. Now, some people may see this as a further evidence to the rumor that Kaga allegedly made Thracia difficult in order to sell strategy guides. But in the end, like with many mysteries surrounding Thracia 776, we likely will never know.